Path of Exile's Keepers of the Flame update has been fully unveiled, and GGG have also deployed the patch notes containing some big changes, not just to specific builds, but also more sweeping changes that will have a large effect game-wide. Now, the Keepers of the Flame patch is bringing a massive update to Breach in Path of Exile 3.27, modernising this content with new mechanics, including diversifying the encounters a bit more than just, killing monsters in a circle. There's going to be new Breach realms to explore, new bosses to fight, but they were also quick to point out in the Q&A that they still want Breach to contain that classic simplicity of killing monsters in an expanding circle, which is confirmed to be sticking around, albeit with a lick of paint in 3.27. But that's just the update to Breach. What about those ballistic character balance changes? Well, there's a lot less balance than I was expecting in patch 3.27, but I think much of it will revolve around the new bloodline classes, which are essentially multi-classing for ascendancies. This alone should have a decent impact on the meta, and I expect I'll be discussing a lot of those new bloodline classes on the channel as they reveal the remaining options prior to launch. However, the patch notes weren't completely void of balance changes, so let's get into the 3 biggest winners and 3 biggest losers of Path of Exile Keepers of the Flame. Beginning with the losers. And we're starting with Azurite mapping. I really feel like this change is flying under the radar right now, but this one is going to have a huge impact on players regardless of whether you're playing Trade League or solo self-found, and it's a change to an Atlas tree notable, mining byproducts. Now previously, how this node worked is that you could spec into some Delve spawn chance and grab this notable to essentially passively farm Azurite while you were mapping. You just click the sulfite veins in your map, and 10% of the time, the vein would also grant some bonus Azurite. And as you can imagine, over time you were able to farm quite a bit of this extra resource. Now, if you're not a fan of Delve, you may be wondering what this resource is used for. In Delve content, Azurite is essentially what's used to upgrade your Delve gameplay experience. More light radius for your cart, more darkness resistance, reloading, flares and dynamite resources, and so on and so forth. However, that stuff is not important for why this node was useful, because Azurite is also used to purchase resonators directly from Nico. And whilst you can't purchase 4-socket resonators using this method, you can buy 1, 2 and 3-socket resonators, and the standard 1-socket resonators are the ones that are used for a very large majority of defensive gear crafting in current Path of Exile. These resonators, combined with dense fossils, are a crucial part of crafting high-end defensive gear, among other crafts. However, mining byproducts is changing in 3.27, to no longer provide a chance to obtain Azurite. Instead, it now provides a chance for double sulfite, which is the Delve resource used to actually power the car and drive it to new nodes in the mines. Now, what this means is that in 3.27, you'll no longer be able to passively farm Azurite. You will now need to delve to farm resonators, and this is going to have a huge impact on Trade League and solo self-found in different ways. In Trade League, the price of resonators are going to go up, and the price of some fossils will likely go down. This is because the demand for resonators is still going to be high, but the resources to obtain them are far more limited. People who just want to map and don't want to interact with Delve can no longer farm them, so the supply of resonators is going to decrease, and as the supply decreases, their value will rise. So this will naturally pull more players into the Delve mines, because this area of gameplay becomes generally more lucrative, and with that, the supply of some fossils will also go up, likely resulting in fossil prices dipping a bit. However, the big change here is for solo self-found players. Previously in solo self-found, if you didn't want to delve, you could bypass this mechanic entirely and still be able to fully benefit from using resonators and fossils to craft your gear. You'd use the mining byproduct node to get Azurite and thus obtain resonators, and then you could get your hands on fossils through other mechanics such as Legion or Delirium, and utilize Harvest Juice to swap these fossils to the correct type, usually dense fossils, before attempting to craft your items. But now you'll no longer be able to obtain Azurite outside of delving, so to utilize fossil crafting you will now be forced to delve. Now, I will say that I don't think this is necessarily a bad change, because they did always want the primary mechanic to be the way to obtain league-specific tools. But this change will have a huge impact on how the game is played for a lot of players, so it had to make it onto my list for that reason. Moving on to the next biggest loser, it's BAMA, Blink Arrow, Mirror Arrow. These skills were absolutely obliterated this patch. Now, I think it's fair to have expected a damage nerf to the transfigured versions of Blink Arrow and Mirror Arrow. After all, these skills have been overperforming pretty much since their introduction to the game in patch 3.23 Affliction League. But they didn't just receive a damage nerf this patch, they got hit really hard. And this nerf kind of reminds me of the Frostblades of Catabasis changes in 3.26. Where you could expect a nerf, but not a nerf of that magnitude, and it's the same here. The damage of these skills are being toned down as expected, but on top of that, the duration of the clones that are created is also being lowered, and I could see this change, maybe a small base duration reduction, but this is no minor change. The base duration for the clones from all of the transfigured versions of Blink Arrow and Mirror Arrow is being cut down from 20 seconds to just 5 seconds. That is a wild change on top of the damage nerfs. Ouch. Now, worth mentioning here, in another part of the patch notes, minions no longer require accuracy rating at all. They now always hit with attacks, which is a small consolidation prize for BAMA, I suppose. But overall, I think these skills will feel a lot worse in 3.27, and there will be much better options as a result. Now, the final loser for Path of Exile 3.27 is the Trickster Ascendancy. This one got hit hard in multiple areas where it excelled in previous patches. Firstly, the Soul Drink are notable, which is the Trickster's Energy Shield Overleach. This node no longer provides any bonuses to attack and cast speed. And losing 20% increased attack and cast speed is actually a pretty huge loss. That's going to cut into your damage output and make you generally slower. But it's worth noting here that the Trickster's real upside of being able to solve Energy Shield recovery in a very good way is still fully intact. The Energy Shield Overleach lives on, but the offensive portion of this node has been removed. Now, the Trickster's other option that branches from Escape Artist is the Spell Suppression and Energy Shield Recharge focused notable, Spellbreaker, and this one did not escape either, no pun intended. Spellbreaker no longer provides a chunk of spell suppression chance, so you will now need to find every single percentage point of your spell suppression chance from gear and the passive tree in 3.27. And this is going to put a lot more strain on gearing specifically. And there's another change here that does read like a buff, and it is somewhat a buff. However, for the full context on this change, I must also mention another very big change this patch. One that almost made it into my biggest losers list, and that is that the base spell suppression damage reduction is going from 50% to 40% in 3.27. And the Trickster's Spellbreaker node will now provide an extra 15% suppressed damage while on full energy shield, compared to the 10% of last patch. So this means that last patch with Spellbreaker and no other investment, you were preventing 60% of the damage of a suppressed spell while on full energy shield, and this patch that will be 55%. So comparatively with other classes, this is a buff, but for Trickster specifically, factoring in the base change to suppression, this is another nerf. But we're not done yet, because the most impactful nerf is still to come, one step ahead. Likely the most problematic Ascendancy notable in terms of balance ever since the introduction of Tier 17 maps. Well, this patch is getting a very big nerf. This notable will no longer provide a minimum action speed increase, and instead will now only function as a defensive investment. Instead of providing 108% minimum action speed, it's now setting that minimum action speed to 90%. So that means that the impact of this line is only felt if you're being actively action speed slowed by something, like temporal chains, or chill, or freeze. If you're not being slowed, your action speed will be at 100% or higher, so you won't gain any benefit from this. The other defensive portion of One Step Ahead is the fixed action speed of nearby monsters, and this is actually getting a small buff, now setting their speed at a maximum of 90% of base rather than 92%. So that's nice if you don't have any methods of applying action speed slows to monsters, but this won't offset that huge nerf to the notable. Now, Trickster did receive a buff to the Heartstopper node, which is the pendulum defensive mechanic that swings back and forth between protecting you from hits and protecting you from damage over time. And even though this does provide a lot of damage mitigation, it's an entirely unreliable defensive mechanic, which isn't great to say the least. Now let's move on to the biggest winners for patch 3.27, beginning with Hardcore Trade League. Now, trade leagues in general are receiving a huge win in the Keepers of the Flame update due to the long-awaited addition of asynchronous trade to Path of Exile. But Hardcore Trade League specifically received another big change tucked away in the patch notes. The hardcore variations of Keepers are parented to their standard Keepers equivalent, meaning if you die in Hardcore Keepers, you can continue on in Standard Keepers League. Now, to clarify here, GGG use the term standard when they refer to the softcore versions of a league. So what this patch note is getting to is that dying in Hardcore Keepers Trade League now takes you to Softcore Keepers Trade League, and dying in Hardcore Solo Self-Found Keepers League now takes you to Softcore Solo Self-Found Keepers League. Now, this is a big change for Hardcore generally. I expect that Hardcore Solo Self-Found will see a boost in players as a result of this. But the bigger change here is in regards to Hardcore Trade League, which will also see that player boost, but the bigger impact will be felt for the Hardcore Trade League economy. In previous patches, dead Hardcore characters would migrate straight to actual Standard League, i.e. the permanent Standard League where all of the legacy items and characters reside. And this has been a really big problem for Hardcore Trade League, because it means that the only way to obtain league-specific items in Standard was to purposefully rip a Hardcore Trade character with those items in your inventory to get them to Standard, and this has created a pressure within the Hardcore economy for valuable items. Pressure which has primarily come from RM tiers. They come to Hardcore Trade and buy up some of the most valuable league-specific items to rip them from the league, removing them from the economy and taking them away from players that actually need them and want to use them in the league. This has been happening for years and years. One of the more recent examples that I can remember when this was really bad was in the Trial of the Ancestors League, where RM tiers were consistently buying up all of the Hinakora's locks in Hardcore Trade for about 10 or 20% more than they were actually worth, removing them from the economy and skyrocketing their value with the loss of supply. Well, no more. In 3.27 and presumably all future leagues, dead hardcore characters will migrate to their parent temporary league, which means you can no longer obtain any league-specific items in Standard in any way until the league actually ends, which is a great change and a massive win for Hardcore Trade specifically. Next up in the winners, it's Bone Shatter. Yes, the Bonezone may be back with this update, but don't expect all of the melee enjoyers to log into this skill come launch, because there's another melee skill that probably should have been nerfed in this patch but didn't get touched at all. More on that in a moment, but first, the Bone Shatter change. This skill will now provide 3 to 6% more damage per stack of trauma based on gem level, up from the 2 to 4% in previous patches. And there's a couple of things to note here. Firstly, this is only the base version of Bone Shatter. This doesn't affect the complex trauma transfigured variant, which is quite good for bleed setups. However, the base Bone Shatter is still one of the better strike skills in the game due to its inherent flat damage and incredible damage scaling. And in 3.27, this damage scaling is being improved quite significantly. Now secondly, the scaling based on gem levels looks to be changing this patch because the more damage multiplier variance is increasing from 2 increments between levels 1 and 20 in the previous patch, that being going from 2 to 3% more damage per trauma to 3 to 4% more damage, to 3 increments in 3.27, 3 to 4, 4 to 5 and 5 to 6% more damage per trauma. And that means that the breakpoints for these increments in terms of gem levels will also change. And this is significant when it comes to Bone Shatter because the gem deals self-damage based on not just how many stacks of trauma you have, but also the level of Bone Shatter. Sometimes it can be more beneficial to utilise a lower level Bone Shatter, as even though the flat damage is lower, you may be able to sustain a much higher number of trauma stacks, and therefore you're actually able to deal a higher amount of damage when fully ramped. And this is something that will need to be reviewed with the new multipliers on the updated skill. But even without factoring in any of that, the bottom line is that Bone Shatter is going to be quite a lot stronger in 3.27. However, I do want to note that even though Volcanic Fissure of Snaking took a pretty sizable nerf in the patch notes, Earth Shatter wasn't touched at all. And even though the playstyle is not for everyone, Earth Shatter was likely better than Volcanic Fissure last patch, and it will certainly be better this patch. So even with these Bone Shatter buffs, I expect that the majority of melee enjoyers will be logging into Earth Shatter slams come launch. Now, the final winner for Path of Exile Keepers of the Flame is bossing, or more specifically, boss running services, or boss carries. This one is really straightforward. GGG are adding bloodline classes to the game in patch 3.27, and these are essentially a multi-classing, multi-ascendancy option that you can choose to invest into if you want to. How this is going to work is that you can choose a secondary ascendancy known as a bloodline class, and your ascendancy passive points will be shared between your primary ascendancy and your bloodline class. You can spend as many points into either as you want to, but you'll still only have a total of 8 points to spend between them. And they've made sure to design bloodline classes so that they never have more than 6 total points to spend, which means that no matter what happens, your primary ascendancy will still matter because you'll still have some points invested in there, even if it's only a single notable. But how does this relate to bossing? Well, to access bloodline classes, you will need to defeat specific bosses. For example, you can unlock access to the Chaos Bloodline by defeating the Trial Master at the end of an ultimatum, or the Ritual Bloodline by defeating the King in the Mists. And we know that all the Crystal King in Delve will also have an associated bloodline class, as will Olroth, the Expedition boss. And this means that this league, more than ever, there will potentially be a lot of value placed on bossing, especially early into the league when players want to unlock access to these new build customization options. This is especially true for obscure bosses like All in Delve, that are much harder to access. Seeking out bosses and offering boss carry services in trade leagues will likely be much more profitable than ever before. So if you enjoy bossing in Path of Exile, you may want to look into that for this upcoming league. And that's it. My biggest winners and losers for Path of Exile Keepers of the Flame. But what about you? Are you happy with the patch notes? Do you think the meta will change enough with the introduction of bloodline classes and Foulborn unique items? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.